Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards.
If you're listening to this podcast, then you're in great company. We've got thousands of listeners who have a thirst for continual improvement and raising standards in business. Whether your interest is in quality, sustainability, or risk standards, I'd love to welcome you as a member to our online platform for all things ISO, the ISology Hub. The ISology Hub is the leading place to get access to all of your online resources, from in-depth training courses through to our very popular coffee break training, to templates and action plans and many other resources to help raise standards. As a member, you get access to over 100 courses, taking you from learner to practitioner to leader. The ISology Hub has all the resources that you need, which will really help to make your life easier and to help improve compliance in those business critical areas. So if you'd like access to learning and compliance resources ranging from data privacy to environmental management, anti-bribery, business continuity, quality, health and safety, to name just but a few, the list is endless actually, then we'd love for you to come and join us. Just head over to the isologyhub.com.
Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of the ISO Show. I'm Ian Battersby. I'm a senior ISO consultant with Blackmores UK Limited. Today we're going to talk about risk management in management system standards. It's a fundamental aspect of every one of the management system standards, but it's often misunderstood. So it's well worth consideration as part of an ISO show. Today, we're talking about risk. So what is it, risk? What is risk management? We're talking specifically about risk management within the standards, the management system standards. There's a whole separate standard dedicated to the subject of risk. There is ISO 31000, as it's known, quite simply, risk management guidelines. There's 60 pages of interesting stuff in there, if anybody ever wants to go and read it. There is, I'll prompt you all to go and get a copy of it. What is risk? In that standard, risk is very simply defined as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. A note one to that definition is an effect is a deviation from the expected. It can be positive, negative, or both, and can address, create, or result in opportunities or threats. So there you go. Risk isn't just a bad thing, it can be a good thing. So we need to remember this throughout. In the management system standards, the main requirements around risk look like they appear in Clause 6, planning. So for example, in ISO 9001 quality management, Clause 6.1 is actions to address risks and opportunities, and that's mirrored throughout every management system standard in 6.1. So there it says actions to address risks and opportunities. So there's a positive and a negative aspect mentioned right from the start of the requirements and the standards. But while this is the clause which explicitly requires a determination of risks and opportunities, the whole standard, the other management system standards as well, are built on a risk-based approach. And it's mentioned well before there are any requirements laid down. What we tend to talk about in the standards when you're talking about certification or audit, anything like that, are the clauses from 4 to 10, with 4 beginning at context and 10 as improvement. But right at the beginning of ISO 9001, in clause 0.1 in the introduction, it's a clause not commonly referred to in audit, but fundamental all the same. That says and I quote, "This international standard employs the process approach which incorporates the plan, do, check, act cycle and risk-based thinking." And then goes on to say, risk-based thinking enables an organisation to determine the factors that could cause its process and its management system to deviate from the planned results, to put in place preventive controls to minimise negative effects, and to make maximum use of opportunities as they arise. But the intro goes on to mention risk and risk-based thinking multiple times, and clause 0.3.3, as part of the introduction again, is actually entitled risk-based thinking. And then there's also an annex to 9001, which is also called risk-based thinking. So it is a formal concept and the basis for the management systems approach in the modern form of management systems. What it says in the standard is risk-based thinking is essential for achieving an effective quality management system. The concept of risk-based thinking has been implicit in the past. Okay? So it used to talk about things like preventive actions and that sort of thing. But now risk management is explicit in all of the standards. Then it says again, to conform to the requirements of this international standard, an organisation needs to plan and implement actions to address risks and opportunities. So no risk management, no certification to any of those standards. While that sounds prescriptive, adopting a risk-based approach has allowed actually a less prescriptive approach to the standards. It allows us to consider what's significant to us and to plan our system accordingly, rather than having prescriptive documentation requirements as we used to have in some standards. Now, before we talk about the planning clauses, it's worth noting before we reach those that there's an explicit requirement in Clause 5, leadership. I always like to come back to leadership. Top management shall demonstrate leadership and commitment by, among other things, promoting the use of the process approach and risk-based thinking. So we don't just have to embrace the risk-based approach. Our leaders must promote it. Note, the language does not allow them to delegate this. They shall do it. It's worth considering just for one moment how any of us have been able to demonstrate that in an audit. The word shall indicates a requirement. So in audit, are we actually asking whether our leadership do the things that this clause requires? Worth thinking about. So let's go back to planning in clause 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. Now, the next subclause to that, 6.1.1, says when planning for the management system, the organisation shall consider the issues referred to in 4.1 and the requirements referred to in 4.2. Oh, not that dreaded cross-referencing again, I hear you all say. But well, yes, this is important. Clause 4 is all about context of the organisation. We've talked about it many times in the past. The things which affect the way you operate, the world in which you work, the people and organisations you must consider, the obligations placed upon you. These clauses mention things like positive and negative factors, your ability to achieve intended results. The language we've already encountered, as I mentioned earlier, positive and negative things. And generally, we, as a group, as an organisation, my colleagues and I, establish context through a SWOT and PESTLE. This is not prescribed by any standard, but the notes to clause 4 tend to lead you in that direction. If any listeners have got a method of establishing context which isn't SWOT and PESTLE, which they've found to be effective and has also got them certified, please get in touch. Really would love to hear whether people have another methodology for this, because it's interesting to find out. But for us, the SWOT and PESTLE helps us to establish the link between context and risk quite well. You already have opportunities defined in a SWOT, and the standard requires you to identify opportunities. Our strengths in the SWOT may also help us to generate opportunities. Weaknesses and threats in a SWOT can also be viewed as possible risks, negative risk. Pedestal entries can be viewed as both positive and negative. So we can see risk-based thinking forming when we're in the clause on context. While there's no real need in the standards to create a cross-reference from your context documents to your risk ones, it can be a very good demonstration that you've met the requirement in 6.1.1, which said, in planning the quality management system, the organisation shall consider the issues referred to in 4.1 and the requirements referred to in 4.2. So you think about context and what exactly are you going to do once you've thought about context? Well, the standard says you shall determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. And these need to be addressed to do a number of things which are cited there. To give assurance that the system can achieve its intended results, to enhance desirable effects, which is good, positive, to prevent or reduce undesired effects, and to achieve improvement. So you'll see that the planning side of things is thinking positively and negatively throughout. It then says the organisation shall plan actions to address these risks and opportunities and how to integrate them into your system processes and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions. Actions taken to address risks and opportunities shall be proportionate to the potential impact on the conformity of products and services. This is from 9001. It's about the quality of what you deliver. So I said adopting risk-based thinking allowed a less prescriptive approach to the standards. It allows us to consider what's significant to us and to plan our system accordingly. This is where that really does come to life. Actions and our processes that we develop, which are meant to address the risks you've identified, which are relevant to the context of your organisation. Risk-based thinking turned into action. Like I said before, we used to talk about preventive action, but in the annex to ISO 9001, it says one of the key purposes of quality management system is to act as a preventive tool. Okay? Consequently, this international standard does not have a separate clause or subclause on preventive action. That's gone, that's disappeared. The concept of preventive action is expressed through the use of risk-based thinking in formulating management system requirements. So if people are still discussing preventive action in any of their systems, they need to turn that on their head and think about the planning for a risk-based approach. You plan for the things which might go wrong, rather than waiting for them to actually go wrong and then take steps to stop them happening again. That's the concept of preventive action. So, how do we document these risks and opportunities that we've just determined? Now, the standard again says, although 6.1 specifies that the organisation shall plan action to address risks, there is no requirement for formal methods for risk management or a documented risk management process. Organisations can decide whether or not to develop a more extensive risk methodology that is required by this international standard, e.g. through the application of other guidance or standards. So, just because you need to determine your risks, you don't necessarily need a risk management process or a methodology or anything which is based on guidance in a standard like ISO 31000 that I've just been talking about. There's not even a requirement to have a risk register. But what do you do without one? How do you show that you've determined risk? Okay? There is only a requirement to plan actions to address risk. So you've got to write them down somewhere. Okay? What is a plan unless you've written it down? You could document each risk individually with the plan of actions to mitigate it. And this is fine. And I've worked in organisations where each risk is documented singularly, its own document with the plan included. But a register allows you to see what's happening across all risks. It allows comparison of different types, different categories, across different parts of the organisation and at different levels. It can support decision making and allocation of resource where there's competition for that resource. And let's face it, there is always competition for resource. It can prompt escalation and more significant management attention where it's needed. It can form the basis for reviewing the effectiveness of your processes. So while not a firm requirement, it can be a very useful tool, and it stands as good evidence in any form of audit. So what will my risk register look like? Well, firstly, we've mentioned context already. Okay, so if your risk is related to factors in your SWOT and PESTLE, if you want that sort of thing, mention that. Link them. Cross-reference SWOT and PESTLE entries to risk and opportunity entries. I number each entry in my SWOT and PESTLE and my risk register, and cross-reference the relevant ones across the different tables. My colleague Darren is developing a fairly fabulous linear version of risk management as we know it, which encapsulates the SWOT and the PESTLE and the risk and opportunity across one line item in a full table. Good stuff. Looking forward to getting stuck into that. You should also relate it to the interested parties affected by it. That's a requirement in the standard. So, for example, the risk that your processes deliver the wrong product, for instance, directly relates to your customers, interested parties. The risk of enforcement, if something goes wrong in your organisation and you breach a regulation, may relate to your board because they are the people who have to accept responsibility for that. The risk of terrible PR may affect your investors. The risk of polluting may affect your local population. And it may also affect enforcement agencies as well, and your board, again, for that matter. And certain standards require you to determine compliance obligations as well. And those are compliance obligations which are associated with your interested parties. So it may be useful to identify the compliance obligations as well. So if you've got specific regulatory requirements governing your activities. Then, what is the impact of the particular issue if it materialises? Okay, remember both positive and negative. Then we need to evaluate that, measure the significance of that impact if it materialises, the size, the scale. I'll come back to talk a little bit more in detail about the methodology for this, but it is a topic in its own right. So, what we have to do now is measure the size of this impact in the current situation if we've done nothing. So for the current situation, we should indicate which processes we have in place which might control that risk. Remember, there's a requirement to plan, to integrate and implement the actions into our system processes. So it's about the processes which we have to control risk. So, for instance, if we have a risk relating to competence, say, our recruitment process may be a controlling process. Our annual performance management review might be a controlling process. So we should cite these as the things which control the risk we've identified. Okay. We should also then we rate our risks in the current do nothing form. This is based on the type of measure we use when evaluating, judging significance. So where does this risk actually stand on an organisational level? This is where it helps to have a register where different types, categories of risk can be judged alongside each other. We can see what's really important in one place. This is where a register comes into it. So we can discuss with each other and justify actions in a common language on a common basis. Now, there's a further judgment to be made here, and this is very much a judgment for organisations to make. An organisation needs to decide what level of risk it's prepared to accept. This may be a straightforward decision, where a specific value triggers escalation and action, and it is a must do that if that trigger is met, it must be reduced. But it may be more complex than that, depending on the organisation you're in the environment in which you operate. I will come back to this concept, the acceptability of risk, in a moment. If the risk is acceptable, should we still commit resource to addressing it? There's a balance in reducing risk overall across an organisation. And we have to consider, have we got an easy win here? Is it easy to put in place an action to minimise a risk, which will help the organisation overall even though this individual risk is below our level of acceptability. Now, if we feel we should address a risk, what method of risk treatment should we adopt? Well, that's a specific word used in risk management and risk standards. I'll explore treat again in a moment. The actions we propose to take should be set out in proper detail. Who will do what by when? With what resource? What are the measures to assess effectiveness? How will we verify it? What evidence will we need in order to show that we have been effective? And if a risk, a significant risk, or a group of associated risks require an objective, in your register state clearly that objective or link to where the objectives are in this specific one that addresses this risk or group of risks. Let's see how the detailed programme of work on an objective is planned and delivered, and relate that programme of work directly to the risk. And then, considering what we plan to do to try and affect that risk, to try and bring it down, how will that ultimately affect the level of risk? We need to determine in our register what we will assess and record around this residual risk, as we call it. So should our plan be successful, what will the final level, the residual risk, be? And that is the plan. What type of risks? Well, risks could be from any source in the organisation, okay? For any given management system standards, quite simply put, it's those risks which affect our ability to meet the requirements of the standard and our ability to deliver the associated objectives. So, for 9001, quality management, it's the ability to consistently deliver the best we can to our customers. For 45,001, which is health and safety, it's the ability to protect from harm our workforce and anybody affected by what we do. This is about the organisation and its ability to do what it must. But quality risks, for instance, don't just stem from, say, our manufacturing processes, if that's what you're in. They involve our ability to fund the right equipment and the infrastructure we need, or the ability to get investment in sustainable future, the competence of our personnel, the safe working environment to deliver our products and our services, our compliance with relevant legislation, the forces affecting our market, the stability of our supply chain, our reputation, social attitudes to work and technology. These are all things which affect our ability to deliver a quality product. Myriad items. And the same goes for other standards. And you could see from a number of the things I've just mentioned that they could affect things like health and safety or environment or other things. So other management system standards. And if you've got an integrated management system, well, the list could be endless. There are great links between those. So regardless of whether you're certified to a multitude of standards, your organisations are so interdependent that you can't separate, say, financial risks from operational ones. So a risk register covering all risks can be very useful. They are all organisational risks affecting your ability to meet requirements of different standards. And very much the larger you get, this sort of approach is required. So how many risks would you put in your risk register? This can be really tricky. It's easy to get overwhelmed by generating a huge risk register when you're a small organisation. So be realistic. What's really significant to your organisation? If you do a swap and pestle, if it generates lots of issues, does everything need to be treated as a risk or opportunity? What will actually have an impact on you if it materialises? What is beyond your control or influence that you can do, therefore, nothing about? What requires just monitoring because you can't do anything about it? If you have, say, 25 staff, maybe 250 items on a risk register is a bit burdensome. How would you action them? How would you monitor them? Report progress against them? How can people possibly take control of all of those items? A large organisation will tend to generate a large risk register. But They can then categorise it in many different ways. They can split it by functions, by categories such as operational, safety, compliance, financial, whatever it is which is important to various parts of your organisation. You can then split it by significance. You can split operational risks from the strategic or corporate thing and escalate from one to the next. This can be done by the scale of the risk. Any risk above a specific threshold, we talked about thresholds before, could be escalated to the strategic level. There could be factors in the risk evaluation, which includes strategic significance, not just a threshold in terms of value or something numerical. There could be specific subjects, such as compliance, which you automatically escalate to a strategic level should there be a breach. And how do you then measure? How do you measure this significance, the risk rating? Okay, evaluation as it's known in the standards. Now let's keep this simple. There are lots of complex and sophisticated ways of doing this. Certain sectors, industries, processes even, have specific needs and ways of evaluating risk. But if you're new to this, or there aren't such complexities to consider, a very simple methodology is best, certainly at the start of this journey. This is a topic in its own right, but my advice is to keep the simple matrix of consequences by likelihood. Simple numbers. Consider what the impact would be if the risk materialised. From 1 to 5. Simple. Some people use 1 to 3, some people use 1 to 10. I like 1 to 5. It's not overly complex, you haven't got very fine grades between each level, and it's not too simple, which might expose your decision making somewhat. And let's take number 1. Okay, at this level, the consequences are not significant. It would only be a slight impact on the organisation, maybe a minor disruption to what you do, small financial loss, little or no physical harm. Up to level 5, the consequences are quite disastrous. It could materially affect the way the organisation operates. It could cause severe physical harm. It could lead to significant financial loss. It could totally prevent us delivering product or service. Right, so these are all different categories. And if you look across those different categories, it helps you as an organisation to judge where to plan your activity. You can justify actions across different things. These things could be qualitative, as I've just described there, but they could also be quantitative. Actual pounds and pence, days and hours of disruption to your organisation. You could combine the two approaches. You could rank consequences across different categories, some which might be numerical, like financial, some which may not be, like level of harm to individuals, or even reputational loss, those sorts of things. And then you can rank those different things by the same methodology. Now next, what you do is you consider the likelihood of that event occurring. What's the probability? Again, use 1 to 5. 1, it will very rarely happen. 5, it happens regularly. Or it is certain to happen. Or again, it could be more quantitative. 1 equals once every 5 or 10 years. 5 equals it happens daily, continually, weekly. Okay? That judgment is your own. Then you multiply these numbers and plot them on a matrix. Very simple. The bottom left is green, the top right is red. The position and the numerical value then indicate the level of resource you should apply to addressing that risk. And let's talk opportunities as well. You can also evaluate opportunities in a very similar manner. Rather than assessing negative consequences, you add a numerical value to consider the positive impact on the organisation should that event occur. So things like financial gain, improved market share, reduction in physical harm, reputational improvement, reduced waste, improved productivity, better governance and reporting. These are plotted in exactly the same way, but with, green to better green. Okay? So as you go towards the top right of your matrix, you are getting more gain for the organisation from realising that opportunity. Now, I mentioned acceptability. How acceptable is a risk to you? And this is something you add to your register. There is a concept called appetite and tolerance. Some organisations employ this concept. Some are required to. In the public sector, it's quite a common sort of thing. Risk appetite can be defined as the amount and type of risk that an organisation is willing to take in order to meet their strategic objectives. Thanks to the Institute of Risk Management for that particular definition. Now, organisations will have different risk appetites depending on their sector, their culture, their own objectives. And they may have a range of different appetites for different risks. And these may in fact change over time depending on the strategic outlook. And these appetites range from things which we describe as averse or cautious to things we describe as open and eager. Okay? For example, a public sector risk appetite could be one affecting a local council. Right? This council may adopt a cautious approach to financial management while having an open appetite for innovation in its digital service delivery, for instance. This balances the need for sort of fiscal responsibility with the desire to improve efficiency and often accepting higher risks for longer term gains. Okay, so risk tolerance next. Slightly different. This is the actual threshold that you can get away with, that your organisation can bear before action or escalation is firmly needed. That could be financial, operational, reputational, enforcement risk, okay? So this concept may not be for you if you're at an early stage of development, but it's a concept you need to adopt at some point because you need to judge what is acceptable to your organisation somehow. Now, this is all about planning. Clause 6 is planning. If we feel we should address a risk, what method of risk treatment should we adopt? ISO 31000, the risk management standard, suggests certain things. You avoid the risk by deciding not to start doing something or not to continue doing something that gives rise to that risk. You could take the risk or even increase your level of risk in order to pursue an opportunity, again the positive side. You could remove the risk at source. You could change the likelihood of it occurring. You could change the consequences should it occur. You can share the risk. You can subcontract to another organisation which is better placed to manage the risk for you. You can buy insurance to cover you should you accept that risk and something still go wrong. And then you can just retain the risk by informed decision, as we say. Okay? This is where you can't do anything about it, potentially. You have no influence or the cost is too great to rectify it. So you monitor that to ensure that it isn't adversely affecting your organisation. So that's the planning side of things. So that's really what risk management is about. It's planning to adapt to uncertainty, to put in place controls to mitigate anything that might go wrong or take advantage of things that are opportunities. Now, there are some distinctions here that we need to talk about, and many of the standards have their own concept of risk. ISO 45001 in clause 6.1, this is health and safety, says the organisation shall establish, implement and maintain processes to assess occupational health and safety risks arising from the identified hazards while taking into account effectiveness of existing controls. This is about sort of job-based, activity-based, process-based risk assessment, not organisational. The next subclause says it should then determine and assess the other risks related to the establishment, implementation, operation and maintenance of the management system. So there's a distinction between operational risk assessment affecting people doing the job and the organisational risks affecting the system. You may escalate significant hazards up through the organisation if they affect the organisation, but the two would be distinct in many circumstances. If we take ISO 22301, which is the business continuity standard, That has clause 6, planning for the organisation, the risks to the organisation and to the system. But also it says in 8.2.3 that the organisation shall identify the risks of disruption to the organisation's prioritised activities and to their required resources. Right, so the organisation's prioritised activities fall out of doing a business impact analysis. It's got a very helpful note beneath that. Note, risks in this subclause relate to the disruption of business activities. Risks and opportunities related to the effectiveness of the management system are addressed in 6.1. So if you are doing a business continuity management system, do not confuse the organisational and system level risk assessment with the business impact assessment's risk assessment, if you follow me. So be very cautious in the standards not to confuse these types of organisational system risks with specific risks cited further down in the standard. So finally, I want to talk about governance. This risks register is not a static document. You need to evaluate regularly and report regularly against what's happening. Management review in every standard requires that you look at the effectiveness of actions to address risks and opportunities. But this should be done quite continually at very regular intervals. What we want to see is progress. So it makes sense to have an indicator in your risk register of what the level of risk is at any time during the progression from the initial risk assessment to the final residual position. Where are we now? Have we got to the final act where we have reduced risk as far as we can through the actions we've planned? And that's what we want to see quite continually. Not just once a year, not just prior to certification. A risk register is a living document. So my final point here is that the register isn't evidence of good risk management in itself. It's how you use it to demonstrate that your actions have addressed risks and opportunities, which counts. So that's quite a long one on risk management, but it's a big topic and deserves a lot of time, I think. So I'll leave it there, since it's been a long one. But before I go, I'd like to remind everybody to subscribe to the ISO show on your preferred media player, if you've not already done so. And if you have a spare 5 minutes, please leave us a review. Nice shiny 5-star review would be fabulous. The review process helps us to get out there to reach a wider audience. As always, as I always ask, please, if there's any questions, if you want to ask anything, or you'd like to suggest anything for a future topic, feel free to send us an email, contact us directly, comment through your media player. If you want, we'd love to hear from anybody who's got any ideas or any queries. So that's all from me today. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch up with you on the next ISO show. Goodbye.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.